Welcome to the morning show. We're broadcasting to you on Channel 9 on WJOP-LP Newburyport at FM 96.3. We're also coming to you on Newburyport Community Media's YouTube channel at ncmhub.org. I'm your host, Mary Jacobsen, and I'm so happy to welcome my guest this morning. Brian Castner is here. He's a nonfiction writer. He's a former explosive ordnance disposal officer and a veteran of the Iraq War. His most recent book is Stampede, Gold Fever and Disaster in the Klondike, which will be a featured book in the upcoming Newburyport Literary Festival. He's also the best-selling author of Disappointment River, of All the Ways We Kill and Die, and the war memoir, The Long Walk, which was also adapted into an opera and named a New York Times editor's pick and Amazon Best Book of the Year. Brian, welcome. Thank you so much for taking time to visit the morning show.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be with you.
Well, likewise, Brian. I so enjoyed your book. As I've mentioned to you, I found it just fascinating. And I'm curious to find out as we start, what drew you to this absolutely extraordinary story of the 1897 gold rush in the Klondike? It's a story of truly jaw-dropping delusion, greed, ambition, mortal, and by mortal, I mean life or death, hardship, and folly on a massive scale.
Yeah, so I guess that's part of what drew it, the story I was drawn to there. I wish I could give you a really satisfying answer of the eureka moment when I realized I wanted to write a Klondike book. I think like many writers, I keep a little sketchboard. I keep a whiteboard next to my writing desk. And somewhere over the years, the word Klondike appeared. I don't remember writing it down. I can't tell you what the inspiration was. I've written another book about the North. I wrote a book called, you mentioned Disappointment River, which was about Alexander Mackenzie, who was actually the first white man to cross North America. It wasn't Lewis and Clark, like you might have learned in school and I learned in school. So I'd written a book about the Arctic North before. Probably somewhere in there, I started looking on the map and realized that the Klondike was just the next mountain range over, and had that inspiration. But when I was fishing for a new book to write, and I was looking for a topic, and I looked at that list and I started to look into the Klondike. I mean, the things that you mentioned were the reasons that I ultimately decided to carry it forward and write a book about it. Because, I guess looking at it through modern eyes, because a lot of the popular histories, the most definitive histories of the Klondike were written back in the 1950s. So there's really not been, the big book is Pierre Burton's still from back then. I read it with modern eyes and I saw a disaster movie. It's shipwrecks and famine and murder and freezing to death and scurvy and all of these things. And I like reading about, Everest stories, and I like reading about shipwrecks, and I like reading about Shackleton in the Antarctic and, Krakauer's tales in Alaska. Yeah. And this was a chance in some ways to write about all those things, just all in the same book.
You're right. It touches upon almost every imaginable kind of Titanic level disaster. And when you're writing about that, especially a self-inflicted disaster like this, you're dealing with human nature too. So it does have everything, Brian. Well, thank you for that. I was hoping that you could set the stage for us of the historical context for this disastrous stampede, both the economic conditions for ordinary working people at the closing of the Gilded Age, and also the role that Alaska and the Yukon wilderness played in the American imagination at the time.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was really the union of those two things, which is how you ended up with the gold rush. So there's a question I'm often asked is, why would people leave their homes and travel to Alaska in the winter? And to understand that, you first have to start with the economic conditions. So the Panic of 1893, which most of us have never heard of, at the time was the worst depression that the United States had ever endured. And like you said, it was at the end of the Gilded Age, and you had these titans of industry, the Vanderbilts and the Rockefellers and such. The gap between rich and poor at the time was enormous, not unlike our own time. And just wages were so low. And, really through the course of that depression, it's going to sound like a lot of, current economic conditions, say with the Great Recession, banks went out of business. The railroads went out of business, which were kind of the equivalent of e-commerce or the internet boom at the time. When the banks went under, and then people's mortgages were underwater, they couldn't afford to pay their mortgages. That led to the banks. The average wage at the time, if you worked in a factory in the new industrial age, was 10 cents an hour, which corresponds to about $3 an hour now. And so you just had this like broad economic malaise. And then as that's happening, and as there's even a fight about gold at the time, because of course there were silver-backed dollars and gold-backed dollars, and not to go on to the economics, we're all bore everybody, but gold dollars were actually worth more than silver dollars. And of course, then the rich kept those. At the same time that you had all these economic troubles, you had these headlines appear in the newspapers in the summer of 1897 that there was gold discovered in the Klondike. Now, nobody had ever heard of the Klondike. They thought it was kind of up in Alaska. It's not really. It's actually over the Canadian border. That kind of geography didn't matter so much. But the Alaska at the time was seen as the last West, as one of the characters in the book says. It was the last frontier. It was the last place without a railroad and without law and order. And, all of the old boom towns around the West in Colorado and Nevada, California, certainly, they had all run out. And, for people that were looking for new opportunity, the kind of person that would have gone west, say in a wagon train, and was looking for a new place to go, Alaska was really the last opportunity. I should say, though, having said that, the West attracted a lot of families and a lot of homesteaders and people who wanted to settle. Not a lot of homesteading in Alaska. And so one thing that made it different was it was overwhelmingly male. And it was overwhelmingly white. And those factors ended up really impacting both the few women that went up there, and then also the indigenous people and people that were already living in the area.
Yeah. Well, Brian, thank you for setting the stage for us in that. And it's clear, that there were multiple draws that just, some of it economic desperation and an economic dream of hitting it rich. As well as the sense of adventure, the need for expansion to, the final frontier. So thank you for that, Brian. It sets the stage really well. So Klondicitis, as it's sometimes called, which took off big time in 1897. Give us a sense, Brian, of the scale of the crowds that were drawn north to the final frontier of the time to mine for gold.
Yeah, we only have kind of a general sense of how big the crowd was, and I'll get into some of those challenges in a moment, but we think it was about 100,000 people. Now, for comparison, 100,000 people at the time was like the combined population of Seattle and Los Angeles. So it was an enormous number of people. When much of the crowd got to Dawson City, eventually, and it was 30 or 40,000 people there. It was the largest city in Canada, west of Toronto, I think. It became this enormous place. But we don't know how many it was. And we also don't know how many died. And I think that's worth saying when we talk about the disaster nature of this. So again, 100,000 people left. We think about a third of them made it to Dawson City, which means 2/3 did not. Now, out of those 2/3, 60 or 70,000 people, many of them turned around. But many of them died, and we have no idea how many died. And if you just add up the number of people that died in shipwrecks, say leaving Seattle or Portland or Victoria, British Columbia, you get over 10,000 pretty quickly.
Wow.
And then you start to try to add up the number that say died. It wasn't just on ships. People would go up. There was this overland route from Edmonton. Something like 2,000 or 3,000 people tried that, and only 3 or 4 made it total. So how many of those thousands died on the trail anonymously? How many turned around? You have these stories of just drownings on the trail, people that just laid down in a snowbank and never got up. We have no idea. And I tried to start to look at some of these numbers, and I just picked, random newspapers at hometowns of people that would have sent people with Klondicitis. You know, the Library of Congress has this tremendous archive, the Hometown Newspaper Project, where you can just read all these newspapers, and you go to like some random town in Ohio and it'll say, well, you know, 6 local boys died and 3 of them drowned and 3 of them were frozen to death. And somebody, some historian would have to go through and really just read all those newspapers and try to tally it up for us to get a good sense of how many people died in this disaster.
Well, whatever the number of is, it's just an extraordinary loss of life. You know, tens of thousands of people heading up there. I had no idea before I read your book just how many people were drawn by the fever dream of possible wealth, Brian. So it was extraordinary to see just the sheer volume of numbers. And then again, the tragedy of so many deaths, and as you point out just now, so many different ways before they even got to Dawson City. And that brings us to the next thing I wanted to ask you to talk a little bit about, which was the scale, not just of the numbers of people, but even more striking, the scale of the lack of preparation for what they were heading to, the lack of understanding about the climate, the lack of a word we use now all the time, supply chain, but the lack of a supply chain and the living conditions that the greenhorns encountered, because another word we use a lot today, there was no infrastructure to support that kind of massive sudden influx of population. So could you talk about what they encountered, the hardships and the privations they had to deal with once they got there, that then wound up with, sadly, so many deaths?
Right. And I think it's important to say again that we might get this sense that the kind of people that went on this stampede were somehow different in us, that they were, you know, farmers, or they were people that had ranchers, or they were, you know, tough miners from Colorado or something like this. I mean, there were maybe a few of those, but it was mostly urban city people that lived in tenement buildings and rode streetcars and didn't know how to ride a horse, didn't know how to pack a horse, didn't know how to start a fire, didn't know how to shoot a gun, didn't know how to do really any of the things. It's like if you just picked up a piece of Brooklyn and said, now you need to go to Alaska in the winter, it's not so different. In fact, there is a story in the book of a group of you know, a group from Brooklyn there that does try to go and form a mining company, and most of them die on the side of a glacier, not to give away the ending of the book, or at least of that episode. So it really, I mean, they were extremely unprepared, and they tell stories about how obviously the news came in the summer that there was gold. So people were trying to leave in August or September. So by the time they arrived up there in October, November, December, it's wintertime. Yeah. And, you know, there's stories about how like they would show up in suits and patent leather shoes, and then on the boat, they would get changed into brand new clothes. And it's like they were wearing a costume. It's not like they had any experience with it. Yeah. There were all these lists of what to buy. You need to buy flour, and you need to buy this and buy that, and maybe bring a boat. And, you know, some people were packing in chests of drawers and a croquet set. And one guy brought oxen, and like, it was just all manner of people that would show up because, like you say, this was the places like Skagway on the coast in Alaska were classic boomtown, did not have any of the infrastructure. And eventually the Northwest Mounted Police on the Canadian border made a rule that you had to bring a year of food with you, the famous 1,000 pounds or 1 ton of goods, depending on which account you read. And it was because there was famine in Dawson City on the first winter. People showed up, but food didn't show up. And they had real problems with running out of supplies in that first winter because too many people and not enough stuff. Yeah.
It's just extraordinary to imagine, people had no exposure, I guess, to the climate in Alaska. I remember I moved to Buffalo, New York from Virginia to go to graduate school. And even then, and this is, late 1970s, I felt totally unprepared for the winter when it hit, and my first thought was, this must be a different kind of human being who can live in this kind of weather. So just, scale that up by 10 to 100 times. It's just so challenging and so heartbreaking to imagine how utterly shocking it must have been and utterly fatal it was for many people when they got there and ran into a type of weather and a climate that they just had never experienced before and had really no preparation for. And you do an extraordinarily good job of clarifying that in your book, Brian. There's something else I wanted to ask you about that you do in your book that I was really interested in because it seemed different to me from a lot of history books. So the setting is, as to me, it often seemed like a cross between Lord of the Flies and Dante's Inferno. And one of the things that struck me about the quest for wealth was that it was an absolute catastrophe, as you've been talking about, not just for a lot of the people who died in that pursuit, but also it was a catastrophe for animals, for the dogs and the horses who suffered frequently horrible abuse and death. And I think that's always true for disasters, whether they're natural disasters like hurricanes or storms, or human-induced disasters like a gold rush. But it's not usually talked about in history books. And animal cruelty is usually an invisible tragedy in any war. But it's not in yours. You talk about it, and it's part of the emotional impact of that gives pathos to this disastrous episode of history. So I wanted to find out, Brian, what made you decide to include the cost animals in your recounting of this chapter of American history?
Yeah, I mean, thanks for bringing that up. And I think that, I guess the main reason is that history is staring you in the face, in particular in this story, because there were two routes to get over the mountains to get to the Yukon River. I should say at some point that the main route that stampeders would go is you would get on a boat in the lower 48 on the West Coast. You would go up to Skagway or Dyea, which are two ports very close to each other in Alaska. And then you would hike over the pass. And on the other side, you would build a boat and float down the Yukon River until you got to Dawson City. One route was the Chilkoot Trail, which you had to walk, which I hiked as part of the research for the book. But the other one is called the White Pass, or it's known as the White Pass now. But at the time, it earned the name the Dead Horse Trail. And the answer, or the reason I should say, is because thousands, tens of thousands of horses died on that trail. And really for no other reason than just people's ignorance. Yeah. Not just ignorance, like I said, nobody knew how to pack a horse or ride a horse or lead a horse, but there was bad information that trail was easier because it was going to be turned into a railroad someday. It has been now with years of construction, but at the time it was basically just a muddy, slick rock ledge that ran up a particular ravine. And people didn't know how to pack horses. They didn't know how to drive horses. They drove them to exhaustion. A horse was essentially worthless at the top of the pass. And so they would just shoot the horses and leave them at the top and get new ones at the bottom. And then a lot of horses just fell, broke legs, had to be put down or rolled off the side of the trail. There's even a report of one horse committing suicide because of the abuse. And the horse just walked himself off the trail and into the ravine. And so it was waiting, I guess it was waiting to be written about. And the narrator for that particular section, because I run through a number of narrators in this book, no one person saw the entire Stampede. So I have 10 narrators for different portions. The narrator of that part, Tappan Adney, was a newspaper reporter. He was there as a reporter for Harper's. And his father had served in the Civil War and was a farmer and raised livestock and taught his son, that there was tremendous cruelty to horses in the Civil War and basically to do better than that. And so to have the observer of Tappan Adney and to be able to put things in his words and his observations, was really, I think, powerful. And the photographs, back up that his extremely heartrending descriptions, are not sensationalized. They're accurate. Yeah.
It does add to the power of the story, and there are some photographs in there that will stay with me. I think the bones of the horses, where you can still see the shape of the horse, And it simply adds to the power of the story, and it makes you reflect upon human nature. We'll get back to that in a follow-up question I have near the end. But before then, I wanted to ask you also about, as you mentioned before, there weren't a lot of women in the Klondike. It was mostly men. It was white men. But there were some women there, and you also include their stories. There were a very small number of wives of miners, but far more common were what they referred to as the good time girls or prostitutes, some of whom met really grisly fates at the hands of drunken or misogynistic miners, and without, we should say, any legal consequences. It was a horrible thing to steal, and you could be whipped or sent out on an ice floe for that, but murdering a prostitute, not so much. And you include those narratives, which is also part of what makes your story powerful. But the unexpected story that really intrigued me was that of hotel owner Belinda Mulrooney. Could you tell us how she managed to overcome the odds stacked against women, especially women in business, to build a fortune, not through mining gold, but in effect through mining the fortunes of the miners?
That's right. I mean, there were a number of business tycoons that made a fortune because, if you're not going to dig the gold out of the ground, the best thing to do is to try to sell bread to starving men, essentially, which is what Belinda Mulrooney did. I mean, she's a fascinating character. Like you said, one of my goals in the book was to, as much as possible, to highlight the voices of women, which are really hidden in many histories of the Klondike. And Belinda's fascinating because, I mean, she's just like a lightning rod, a spark plug of ingenuity and grit. And essentially as a self-made woman, she shows up and realizes that she can, she starts with one restaurant and then moves to two restaurants and then, builds one hotel and then builds the largest hotel in Dawson City at the time. The other men who own the other hotels tell her she can't build a 3-story hotel, that it'll never work and it'll never heat. And of course, then she goes ahead and builds the first 3-story hotel in Dawson City. I mean, she was, I think that, she is a certain, I guess historically, she's like a lesson in pluck and perseverance, and she really is a self-made person. From a writer's perspective, from a literary perspective, she's fascinating because she gave an oral history, before her death. And actually, she had the most extraordinary life. Is not only as a young woman did she own these hotels, she eventually lost her fortune and gained it back and lost it again. And, she helped during World War II. She was building ships in Seattle, building minesweepers to go fight in the Pacific, so it's funny how how long history stretches. But from a writer's perspective, she gave this incredible oral history. And my goal in the book was to be able to just write the narrative in as pure a way as possible, and not to clog it up with references to, well, in a letter to her cousin or to, in this piece of paper, whatever else. I put all that in the footnotes. But I try to tell the story as clean as I can. And I mean, we have dialogue because she was really specific in her oral histories about what happened to her, and the ability to recreate these scenes that she was in real time was just, she was too good of an opportunity to pass up as a writer.
I totally understand that, and I'm glad you didn't, because it's an amazing story. And her own life encompasses so much history of different eras and the rise and the fall, and it's just amazing. So I'm glad you included her story. It calls out for a film.
I agree. If you know anyone in Hollywood, make sure you give them a call.
Oh, you bet. Okay. Maybe somebody attending the literary festival will have a connection. I hope so, because it'd be it would be an astonishing, jaw-dropping movie. Well, the gold rush, the more we talk about it, the more it strikes me as a tragedy of Shakespearean Greek proportions, really. When you look at the outcome of the desperate effort to defy the odds and endure the extremes we've been talking about, being driven by this contagious dream of becoming, today we'd call what they wanted to become as a 1%er. That's what they were after. But the reality was, as you discuss at the end of the book, that only about 1% of the people who went to participate in the gold rush, only about 1% got rich or anywhere even close to it. So the inequalities of the Gilded Age and the depression that helped spur this gold rush were actually recreated once again in the Klondike. Now, Brian, I know that you yourself have been to war and you've touched extreme conditions and witnessed extreme behaviors yourself. So I'm really curious to find out how you think about the circular nature of history. Is this the fate that our psychology, our proclivity for cloudy reasoning and contagious fever dreams, is this the fate that we're consigned to by this aspect of our psyche? Do you think we'll always wind up in the very circumstances we thought we would escape from? I know this is kind of metaphysical, but your book is the kind of book that drives me anyway to think about these things because it's so extraordinary and it ends in this way, like Macbeth, you know, or Oedipus Rex, with this kind of tragic irony.
Right. Yeah, I guess I'm of two minds about this. And on the one hand, you wonder, like, how did they get duped? How did these people go up and, like, it was a Ponzi scheme? Of course, by the time anyone got there, all the best claims were already taken. And it was only the people that had gotten there first that actually made any money. It was a bit of a conspiracy theory. It's like, people are taken in by QAnon and all sorts of other conspiracies. This was, in some ways, it was just another conspiracy that drove people to extreme action. And I think it would be easy to condemn them. On the other hand, if you look around the world today, the things that people will do for economic opportunity are incredible. There's people leaving Niger and other places in sub-Saharan Africa, crossing the desert, making it to Libya, trying to get in a boat, cross the Mediterranean, and just for a job to work in fast food when they get to Italy or something. There's people leaving Central and South America and then trying to cross the Chihuahuan Desert and get to the United States. I mean, people are willing to do incredible things to change their circumstances if they're truly desperate. And I wouldn't want to condemn any of those people. Yeah. So I think there is there's a certain human nature of being willing to, like, really endure incredible things for an opportunity for a better life. And so I guess it's your choice if you want to. I'll leave it open to the reader about whether they see a bunch of dupes or it's something to be celebrated.
Well, as I mentioned to you in an email preparing for this, one of the things that I appreciated about your book was that you map out the territory and you include so many stories that drive reflection, but ultimately you leave it up to the reader to kind of make of it what we will. I was hoping also that we might also end with any reflections that you have about contemporary events. There's a war going on in Ukraine right now. And I was wondering, and also the struggle that's much talked about between autocracies and dictatorships and democracies. And I was wondering if you, as you watch the news these days, find yourself thinking about Stampede and whatever it reveals about human nature and the human need for dreams and the human capacity for endurance and the human capacity for brutality. And if so, what about Stampede comes to mind as you watch the news today?
Yeah, I guess, like you say, I've reported from a lot of places. I've seen a bunch of stuff. And so when I guess it is that ability of people to endure and the people that they're, I don't know, I was just in Ukraine. I've seen people survive and escape incredible things. And so I think that does say something about the human spirit. And I think it also, it's just that we don't know what's going to happen in our lives. We don't know what's going to happen in the world. We, in at the end of the Gilded Age, people weren't going to expect a Klondike gold rush is how that the Gilded Age was going to end. And then they didn't expect the Spanish-American War to kick that off the front page. And they didn't expect World War I, to come after that. And, today, as we're going from a pandemic to a war to one thing after another, I don't know, our ancestors survived one thing after another, and I think we can too. And we should just, maybe take some of that spirit to be able to, to keep at it and continue on. It's within you if you dig for it and look for it.
Brian, thank you for that. Thank you very much for that. I find that inspiring. And I am so grateful for the chance to talk to you. Thank you so much for coming on the show today. And I would add for people watching that Brian and I have been talking about some of the stories in the book, and we set the framework, but we've just scratched the surface of the extraordinary, amazing human stories that are in Stampede. So you won't want to miss Brian's presentation at the Newburyport Literary Festival on Sunday, May 1st at 10:15 a.m. To register or for more information about the festival, go to newburyportliteraryfestival.org. And you can also get more information about Brian and his books at his own website, briancastner.com. Brian, thank you so much. It's been a real honor and a pleasure. I learned so much from your book, and I learned even more talking to you today. So thank you for that very much. You take care now.
Thank you so much. And looking forward to seeing everybody at the festival.
Absolutely. Bye, Brian.
Okay.